to sleep, man. Don't go to sleep.
And do me a favor. Don't disturb my friend. He's dead tired.
Well, what the hell are you saying to us? You've lose half your body sleeping.
I sleep pretty hard.
Welcome to Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories.
Hey, what's up? It's Brian.
And hey, it's Murdoch. Welcome to Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories.
You get involved in the show via the email address. It's wearethestoryguys@gmail.com. And here's the thing. I don't know if you noticed, if you looked at what you downloaded today or what has clicked over into your queue, but this is episode 200 of the show. So first of all, I just like to say, holy shit, buddy. Another podcast with over 200 episodes. I'm glad we're doing this together.
This is like officially, like I'd say our second or third podcast, right? And people didn't know what this was.
Right. And we did 250 of Ice Cream Headache. Then we did 40 or 50 of Story Guys, and then Story Guys morphed into this. Who knows? Yeah. Maybe we'll resurrect Story Guys at some point. But yeah, I mean, we've worked together for a long time. We've worked together in different capacities. We've done all sorts of stuff, but this is stuck, and people have kept listening. Yeah,
200 episodes. So it's monumentous. You know, we haven't even thought about how we're going to celebrate at all with this, and we should.
We maybe we'll do some more official celebrating in like a bonus episode and maybe some Patreon content. I don't know. But here's what I thought of as one way to celebrate, and I don't think you're going to like this idea at all. So when we started the show in 2019, I basically had 3 ideas that I came to you with as a pitch. I said, here's what and I remember it was January of 2019 when I pitched this to some other friends, and they were like, yeah, that makes sense. And I knew that you were obviously the guy I was going to do it with, because we were talking about doing the Story Guys concept and some other things. And so when I pitched 3 ideas. I pitched the Ghostbusters theme song, because I had heard that story and thought it was crazy. And then I talked about NXS and Michael Hutchins and Bob Geldof and what a mess that was and what a crazy story that was. And then my third idea was to do a deep dive on my second favorite band of all time, Third Eye Blind. And here's how it shook out, all right? So Ghostbusters was episode 1. NXS was episode 3 of this show, and we never got to Third Eye Blind because it's literally the only decision you've ever vetoed in the history of this show.
Do you know how... Let's just like break through the fourth wall of the podcasting like audience. I feel like all of a sudden like an abusive boyfriend. Like why? And you must have wanted to lash out about that a long time ago.
No,
that's 190. I feel like what a penis move.
No. Here's the thing. We're going to talk a lot about dick moves because that is sort of the subtitle of the Third Eye Blind story. But
Stephan Jenkins, we're going to talk about like a gigantic asshole.
So
he's a lovable, gorgeous one.
But you are a truly lovable and gorgeous guy, and not an asshole. And you literally, it just, again, if we're pulling back the curtain, you don't make a lot of demands on this show. You ride shotgun and you trust me. And
yeah, sure.
And so this is literally, like, I'm not kidding. It's one of the only things where you were like, no, I don't want to do it. So here's what I thought. I thought for episode 200, I get to do this episode. You okay with that?
Well, I mean, what do you mean?
Let's do the Third Eye Blind episode. That's like going to be episode 200.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I knew just seeing the notes, I was like, I'm like not a good friend. And I should have like...
That's not true. That's not true. I just think this is a great story for Rock and Roll Rumors and Innuendo. It's a great story.
I think at the time I was positioning, I was like, we might want to talk about Eric Clapton and Ringo Starr.
Yeah, I mean, I think
all those people.
Okay, that's a good point. I do think that early in the concept, you were like, well, listen, maybe we should do more classic stuff because we don't know if people want to hear about this. I think after 200 episodes, we do know that, one of our highest rated episodes is Oasis, our Oasis story. So we know people like stuff from that general time period. I feel like we've built the audience and a rapport and an expectation. It fits better now. So that is, in fairness, I think you're totally right, and we should say that. But I'm really excited because this is a story that, and I went back in our text messages and I discovered something, which is part of the reason this story was top of mind around the time we were conceptualizing this show was that I was working on a contract at a capacity building some events with and there was another guy being contracted by this company, and I'm sitting with him one day. I don't know if you even remember this. I'm sitting with this guy one day, and he's from San Francisco. And he starts talking about how he was a session musician on some stuff and he had done a bunch of things. And he was working with us in a different capacity, but it was around music. And he mentioned being in American Music Club. So I text you because that's what I do in these sorts of situations, right? I'm like, oh my God, there's this guy. He's been in this seminal indie rock band. And then I start Googling him. And as I'm Googling him, I realize that he's been on a lot of stuff, not just American Music Club. He's been a session musician around the San Francisco scene. And I quickly discover that he had played on my favorite Third Eye Blind record. And I start flipping out because I don't really necessarily want to let on to this guy that I just Googled him, but I really want to know the details about all of this. And so I was like, I only vaguely remembered this story because it was 5 years ago. And so my trusty iPhone, I went back and pulled up our text messages and searched the guy's name. And sure enough, I found the conversation from September of 2019 when we were talking about this back and forth. I did eventually ask this guy. He played piano on Blue. And
yeah, that record.
Yeah, Blue, which we'll talk about in just a second. And he did tell me that Stephan Jenkins was very hard to work with because that was my question, right? I'm like, I've always heard this. And he's like, yeah, he was pretty difficult. And I remember him sort of telling me a couple of stories, but I don't remember the details, and so I don't want to lay them out here because I don't want to put his name to that, right? But he confirmed that, and it made me want to do this story more. And part of it is not just because of my love for that band. I do love that particular album. And I think that album, okay, first of all, I'll admit, it came out my junior year of high school, so I know that there's a nostalgic play here, just like there's Crew records you love that you can say like, yeah, I mean, it may not be great music, but I love it because of when I encountered it or whatever.
Right.
But I also academically know from interviews and research that this was a hugely influential album for music that would come after it. And it was made using production techniques and ideas that even over a quarter of a century later do not sound very dated. Like that record still sounds pretty crisp. And it came out in 1999. And so I think that's all pretty incredible. And that's that album that I just mentioned called Blue. It's their second record.
Okay. But that doesn't start all of this with Stephan Jenkins. Like, he has a backstory. I don't know much about the band, but I know that everyone thinks he sucks. And we've talked about it.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, everyone thinks that guy sucks. I found my feelings summed up nicely during the research by a Reddit user that I came across who also had a great name. His name was let_it_hang. Let it hang. Read Let It Hang's quote about Stephan Jenkins.
Okay, Jenkins is a legendary dick. You can honestly Google it and find 100 different stories, articles, interviews. He is an egomaniac who wants to control everything from the music to the name to the former members. This is just to be petty. That being said, I keep buying his records and going to shows. So,
I mean, that pretty much sums up my exact feelings on the guy. Spoiler alert, the arrogance is real. But here's an interesting tidbit about him, okay? I'm not necessarily going to make a case for the guy. We've done this before on the show where we've talked about Fred Durst and sort of like done this alternate history where we were like, what if he really was actually a genius? I'm not quite to the point where I think you can defend Stephan that hard. But I am going to bring sort of a different view to it because of a couple of things. But I will say this is one of them, and that is he's dyslexic. And now I'm not making excuses, but I think it's worth mentioning that there's a certain level of posturing that comes along with having to fake it till you make it when you struggle with something like dyslexia.
But do you have an excusable excuse to make when your first group is a rap group?
Okay.
If you're Stephan Jenkins,
a white boy San Francisco rap group.
I didn't know anything about this.
Okay.
So once I did and I found out like where they like got placed, I was like, oh my gosh. And I've got a story about that.
Okay. So there is a rap group, but it's actually not his first band. He has the music bug really young and his dad's an academic. So he comes from, and this sort of explains it too, right? So he's dyslexic and he's raised by an academic who teaches at Berkeley and Stanford. So he ends up in these bands with college kids when he's in high school because he's hanging around the campus. And he has this band called Fast Forward, and this is like early 80s. We'll talk about his age, but he's a lot older than a lot of people think he is. And then they break up and splinter into this new wave act called Splash. Now, I'm going to ask you the question that's going to derail us. Do you remember MTV Basement Tapes?
Do I remember MTV Basement Tapes starring the Phoebe Cates of MTV, Martha Quinn?
I'm
Martha Quinn, and what? Gosh, I sent you that text.
I just get a text that was literally just a transcript from MTV Basement Tapes, and I was like, "Did you do that from memory?" And he's like, "Oh no, I'm just like watching it and then copying and pasting from another transcript just to tell you how into this I am."
Yeah, because it had the grand prize, and it was like this huge Casio keyboard bonanza orgy of fun.
And I will say, Martha Quinn, beautiful woman, then and now.
Yes. So it was like a Battle of the Bands-ish thing. Totally, like if you think about it now, completely alien for a national television network.
Yeah,
to do
this is crazy
like
when you think about it in the time period in that context.
83 to 86, maybe?
Yeah.
I think that's when it was.
Yeah, it was not very long. But this band, Splash, that goes to Stanford, there's a guy in the film program there named Lawrence Scheffler II, and he's working on this master's in film production. And if you've known anybody in film school or even high school film classes, there's always like a time at the end of the year where you got to go do something and prove what you've learned, right? And so for one of his film projects, he asks these guys in Splash, with this high school kid, Stephan Jenkins, if he can shoot a video for them. So he calls them over. They come over to his place and they play all their songs that they have recorded, or I don't know if they play them live. I don't know what. He picks this song called Susie, which when he ends up putting it out, he labels it Suzaie, Suzaie, because of the way the word Susie is sung by a guy who will go on to be known for how affected his vocal is, and that's Stephan. This clip ends up winning a bronze medal at the International Film and TV Festival of New York, and it ends up on Basement Tapes.
And this is the first time that Stephan's on MTV.
Don't bother Susan, you need to be free. Let your thoughts go, give a hand to me. Come see what I will show. Sensuality. I bet you said, the feelings start to grow.
It sounds like the lead singer of Third Eye Blind doing a Police cover, which is essentially what it is.
I'm stunned that any of this exists, really, because it's all super new to me, for sure.
Well, and this is really early. Like, this is 1986. Now, just imagine when you encounter Third Eye Blind as the average person. That is over 10 years later. That self-titled Third Eye Blind record happens in 97. So he's been doing...
That's a couple years before Straight Outta Compton.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. And so, to your earlier question, there is indeed a rap duo, though, in Stephan's past, and that comes next. So this is 86, and then in the late 80s, early 90s, he meets this guy from Detroit named Herman Anthony Chun.
So, here's where I have a confession and a story to tell. And this is when I couldn't believe that I found this out about Stephan Jenkins. So he was in a duo, and they were called, as I would call my duo, Puck and Natty. I mean, come on, it's pretty awesome. And they got enough notice that they got label interest, and they got a song on the 90210 soundtrack.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
And now here is the craziest thing. I've never told anyone this story, I guess, because it was so weird and strange.
Man, you have built this up. I'm excited.
So the pilot to 90210 aired on October 4th, 1990.
Mm-hmm.
There's when that was. At some point around there, my mother comes and hands me a VHS tape and starts to tell me about this television program she has recorded off. She's used a VCR and recorded this thing for me to watch. And I don't know if she thought it was wholesome or interesting or educational or going to teach me about sex or what it was. But that began my, like, immediately I could do an impression of Jason Priestley with The Thing.
Oh my God.
But yeah, so that's how I started watching 90210 and then Melrose Place, because it was on right after it.
Fun side note that's not in the notes, just because there's so many rabbit trails to jump down here on this story, but they're called Puck and Natty, which is both a nod to Shakespeare and a it's sort of an inside joke where Stephen's making fun of a jazz group called Tuck and Patty. Well, Tuck and Patty do not like that. And so they end up having to change their name to Puck and Zen. So depending on how you Google or where you Google, you might find this song in this group as Puck and Zen instead of Puck and Natty. But the really key relationship that Stephen forms in this period is not the one he forms with Herman Anthony Chun. That doesn't last super long. It's with another guy. And this is a guy that no one knows. Anybody on the spot, listen to this podcast, I promise you, you don't know who this guy is. But he very arguably becomes incredibly important to the mere existence of what becomes known as Third Eye Blind.
He's basically what would be the other guy.
He's like he is not in the creative sense, but in the getting it done sense.
Yeah, he's like, if ever was another guy. So his name's Eric Gotlin, and he's a straight up business guy.
Kind of square, yeah.
Yeah, and he lives in the neighborhood, and him and Stephen became friends, and he becomes sort of the business side of Stephen's brain, which he probably needed.
Yeah, and that's a very good way to put it, because basically, this is the thing about Stephen. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you so you can understand what comes next, which is that it's always about what he wants to achieve. And he assembles a group to help him do it, and when they get in the way, he disassembles. It's about his goal, not anyone else's. And when you read about early Third Eye Blind and early Stephen and Eric will get grouped together. Now, our friend of the show, Joel Selvin from San Francisco, he does a piece on Third Eye Blind in 1998, very early in their tenure before Blue, and he actually is one of the first articles I could find that basically takes the angle of Stephan Jenkins as an asshole. He's not very easy to get along with. But one of the things he mentions is this relationship that Stephen has with Eric. And he will actually call Eric, I believe it's in that article, a part of the nucleus of Third Eye Blind. So think of science and what a nucleus is. That's like, if you're in the nucleus, you're part of the reason it exists. Like you can't be separated. And he's credited loosely, from what I can tell, for helping Stephen make a couple of key decisions. And the first one of those is helping Stephen realize that he should buy a guitar riff.
So I'd like everyone, we're taking one of those moments in the podcast where we're just hitting the brakes just real quick. So I just want to repeat the words that Brian said, which are buy a guitar riff.
Not buy a guitar. Buy a guitar riff. The lore is that he was writing a whole bunch of songs before he had a band. And when Eric gets behind him, both as a friend and then eventually as a business partner, which we'll get to because he'll offer to pay for demo recordings, Stephen's been working on this tune that they both think has some real potential, but which is based on a guitar riff that was written by Herman Anthony Chun, the guy in Puck and Natty. I think traditionally, when you hear this story, people offer a co-writing credit, right? They're like, listen, why don't I'm making this song, I'll put your name on there, and if it ever becomes a big song, then you'll get a little bit of money. But
yeah, there's never, I'll give you the 145 that you wrote here for the verses, I'll give you like $17 for that.
But Eric, I believe it's Eric's idea, and I could be wrong, but I believe it's Eric who pushes Stephen to say, why don't you just buy it from him? Instead of offering a future interest in this song, why don't we see if we can give him money? And so, now remember, this is just a riff. They offer Herman Anthony Chun $10,000. And he takes it, and they own the riff. And that riff becomes the centerpiece of a song called Semi-Charmed to Life.
Man, can't believe that's a thing.
I can't believe that bet paid off. This is the thing, right? This is used to villainize Stephen. And I think that's a little unfair because I'm mentioning it mostly to show you that he has this relationship with Eric, and this relationship really translates to business savvy. So some of the stuff that he becomes notorious for, I think, is probably because Eric is teaching him this class on business. One thing I come to encounter is that there's like sort of two types of villains, and I call them personal villains, and those are the ones that, sexually harass people and murder people, and those are like the big super villain, superhero story villains. And then there's like business villains, and business villains just do business school shit. They just know how to write contracts and how to get people to agree to stuff that may not be in their best interest. And so it's like not great, but it's not stabbing people with a knife, right? It's just like, hey, I figured out a way to structure something that in a court of law will blah, 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 blah. It takes a lot of school. And part of my theory here is that Eric Gotland is the person that's driving that bus with Stephen. And here's the first example of him doing that. He convinces Stephen to take a $10,000 bet, which is a pretty expensive bet when you've been sleeping on mattresses and doing crystal meth until it lifts you up and then you break. It's amazing that it works out.
This is a quote from Stephen. I was telling these guys that I had these ideas. I wanted a production company. I wanted to write my own rock songs. You're unfocused, everyone said. Everyone except Eric.
Yeah, and this is a reference to him blowing a meeting with Capitol Records. I believe this is broken down somewhere in the show notes. It's a funny story that I don't want to get sidetracked by. But they go to sign the rap duo, and Stephen like blows the whole deal up.
It's kind of funny. I guess maybe he was a jerk. So is Third Eye Blind? It's just his band. Was this really the deal?
Like,
kinda?
It's kind of a solo project.
It is now, but was it always?
So, I mean, to hear him tell it, and again, history is with the winners, right? Like the people who own the name and are controlling the narrative. But it does seem like, at least in the sense that he had the name, he had a lot of the songs way before he meets anybody else or anybody else will become part of the band. But the whole time, Eric Gotland is there guiding him. And so I return to this theme of Stephen's determination, right? He's surrounded in San Francisco by a whole bunch of incredible musicians, and he's going to take advantage of whatever access he can get.
And I never knew that part of the reason that the rap duo makes it as far as they do on the 90210 soundtrack is because Stephen's brother is at a fraternity at UC Davis with Adam Duritz, your favorite band, singer.
Uh-huh.
And so Puck and Natty get the same management as the Counting Crows.
And not only that, they get the same drummer as the Counting Crows. Steve Bowman plays on August and Everything After, then leaves that band. It's a little unclear as to why. Seems like he gets kicked out. And he will then be in a early version of Third Eye Blind, because there's several early versions of Third Eye. But here's the real connection between my two favorite bands, which is that at some point Steven's got this project, and again, he is just boldly looking to get to the level that he wants to get to. And so he knows the Counting Crows are having some success. He knows they're going to play the Fillmore. He writes a letter to Adam Duritz and asks if his brand new band could open that show. And that is the very first Third Eye Blind gig, opening for the Counting Crows at the Fillmore.
So who else is in the early version of this band?
Okay, so not a lot of people that you've like super heard of, familiar names, but people who were in the San Francisco scene. Jason Slater, George Earth. They were both in and around San Fran for a while. Jason, you might know from Snake River Conspiracy, if you remember that band.
So there's been a lot of dudes in this band.
Later in the story, it'll be like, oh, and then we invited so-and-so back in, and he used to be in the band. And you're like, in the early versions of you talking about the band, this guy's name never came up. So it's unclear if there was just a rotating cast of musicians, if there were 4 or 5 or 6 different versions of it. It seems like he starts doing things under this name in like 92, 93. And then I believe it's like in 94, according to future lawsuits, spoiler alert, where he will meet a guy named Kevin Cadigan. And let's talk about Kevin Cadigan. Give us some background on him, because this is the main relationship for the purpose of this show that we need to talk about.
The most important thing to talk about Kevin Cadigan is that his guitar teacher was Joe Satriani.
And like, if you have listened to Third Eye Blind and you know anything about Joe Satriani and can just like imagine his guitar playing, this makes so much sense, because the first 2 Third Eye Blind records kind of answer this question of what if Joe Satriani just like started a pop band.
Yeah, because Satriani's records he had like real revved up songs where the chorus would be what this like a very simple like melodic solo would be, where it's like, it's like the chorus would be like da 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 da, like you would almost could sing it,
right?
So, and then he had really slow, like beautiful kind of ballads and things like that.
And he messed with the sound of the guitar. This all makes sense, because one of the defining characteristics, if you hear a super fan talk about this band, is that they had a guitar sound on those first 2 records that nobody had.
Joe Satriani taught Steve Vai how to play guitar.
Yeah.
apparently Steve Vai showed up at his place with a guitar that didn't have strings. Like, that was a real story how they met. He taught a guy named Kirk Hammett.
Oh my God.
You know, there's Alex Skolnick.
I mean, I don't know if people realize how important he is to the music that comes out of California in the 90s. Yeah,
and now he's apparently running around the country with Hagar and Michael Anthony doing Van Hagar songs,
which
Van Halen songs too.
Makes sense. And it's like literally, if there is no Joe Satriani, there might not be a Metallica. There might not be a Counting Crows. He teaches Dave Bryson from the Counting Crows how to play guitar. There might not be a Third Eye Blind. He teaches Kevin Cadigan. There might not be a Primus or Testament. So not only is what's insane about that is the range. Like, it's not just one style of music.
So the Stephen version of the original Third Eye Blind centers around the idea that he had this name for the band and these songs
right.
before he met everyone else, right? Kevin has a different version, and he will say that for the next 30 years, that Third Eye Blind was always 50-50, right?
Right.
And Stephen peddles this myth-making for sure. I don't know if you've seen this. So do you want to read this quote? It says...
The Billboard quote?
In a retrospective at some point
this
band.
This is hilarious. I'm glad you found this. Okay, this makes me laugh. I wrote Semi-Charmed before I met any of the people in the makeup of the band, or that makeup of the band. He's referring to what people think of as the core Third Eye Blind, who we'll get to. The drum loops on the final record are the ones I originally recorded. I remember sitting in a room with this other songwriter who worked down the street. She was a waitress, and she came up and sat on the bed. And lots of weird details in the story. And we played each other some songs. And I realized years later that the songs we played each other had sold 17 million copies because it was Linda fucking Perry. His story is that before he writes as he's writing Semi-Charmed Life, Linda Perry shows up as a waitress in his life, and it's like, oh, I write songs too. And then they get together to hang out, and she plays him a song called What's Up? Because I'll say, hey, yeah, that song.
Yeah. Right.
What's going on? Now, so notice the myth making in action, all right? We know he bought parts of this song, but every time he talks about it, he takes more and more people out of the story. There's this quote from Eric Valentine, who becomes a big part of making the first record, and I don't know how much I know you're an engineer-producer nerd like I am. You know about Eric Valentine. He's a huge piece of this who gets, like most people, kind of cut out of the story. But he says... quote, a lot of people contributed to that song, talking about Semi-Charmed Life. It's been around for many years, and there are a lot of people who did not get any credit.
But back to Stephen and Kevin together. Here's Kevin describing how they got connected. There's the quote. I was playing with a mutual acquaintance in a band, and Stephen had heard me in some of my songs and guitar playing. He approached me at a club and asked if I wanted to jam and get to work. We hit it off, and I liked some of the stuff he was doing. We started writing, and what would come over the next 2 years was the bulk of the debut record.
So Ryan Salazar is the next guy to enter this story, and he's the bass player in the classic version of this band. And he'll put it this way, quote, nothing in the band happened until Kevin joined, end quote. And he clarifies that the Counting Crows gig happens before Kevin, so technically that's not true. No, it wasn't that nothing happened. But his point is that they don't really get any traction until Stephen and Kevin find this artistic partnership.
And something worth pointing out here is that quickly is the age of Stephan Jenkins.
Yeah. Okay, so I brought this up earlier. You're right. I'm glad you brought it back up.
Yeah, so when he gets signed to Elektra, he's already in his 30s.
Uh-huh.
So he's like an old dude. He's got 5 to 7 years on everyone that he's playing with. It's another indicator of that determination that we've talked about with him, that dying to prove himself energy, that he doesn't stop pedaling. And there are interviews where he often says something to the effect that most people would have quit.
Yeah, this becomes part of the story. Like no one else has this fortitude that I have. And I mean, he's kind of right. I remember having this conversation when I turned 21, because I remember it was the weekend I would turn 21, and I was with two friends who were a little bit older than me, and we were in Chicago. And I was my current wife, girlfriend at the time, she was there. And we were all sitting around talking about the police. They somehow came up in conversation. And these guys weren't 30 yet, but they were closer to 30 than I was. And they were talking about how, hey, the thing I always keep in mind is that the police didn't start until Sting was like 30, and then Andy Summers was like 34, 35. and I have thought about that a lot. And then I soared past 30 and 35. And now I look back and go, I don't know. Okay, maybe my time as a rock star is just not going to happen. But this is another example of that, right? We often think of these stars and these big pop anthems and stuff being young people. I mean, he's youngish, but he's not 21. He's not 25 even. And right. So from here, the tricky part of telling this story is figuring out if you tell it sequentially or if you fast forward and then flash backwards. And I think I'm leaning towards flashing forward.
The loudest weekend of the year is back, louder than live in Louisville, Kentucky, with Slayer, Slipknot, Motley Crue, Korn, Judas Priest, Disturbed, Five Finger Death Punch, Breaking Benjamin, Evanescence, Falling in Reverse, The Offspring, and so many more. September 26th through 29th in Louisville, Kentucky. Passes on sale now at louderthanlifefestival.com.
Third Eye Blind cuts demos. They play showcases. They get attention. They fall on their faces. And then finally, in 96, Sylvia Rohn, who's the CEO of Elektra, gets obsessed with them and they get a record deal. And they make their self-titled record for which Stephan Jenkins gets most of the production credit. And they become superstars. And Sylvia Rohn, you want to talk about her?
Oh, my God. What a badass. We should do an episode of the show just about her. You realize she's like 70-something, and she's still calling the shots. She's still working.
She's the CEO of Sony Music.
Yeah.
Yeah. And under her, Metallica, Missy Elliott, ODB, Natalie Merchant, Jason Mraz, Tracy Chapman, Superdrag.
I mean, Steven will say there was a bidding war over Third Eye Blind. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. There were other labels interested. But he has said, even in the last couple of years, I've heard interviews where he's mentioned Sylvia and what a passion she had for what they were doing. She was very into Third Eye Blind, and he always thought she was a genuine, amazing person. And even when they come to not blows, but they have some, moments of contention later in the story, he always seems to have this respect for her.
So let's talk about the second record that we had talked about earlier.
I love this record
Blue
so much.
Yeah.
Okay, read the Stephen quote from the initial press tour that promoted this album.
Too much fun and feeling like a complete recording group for the first time. We had these jam sessions that were fun.
Yeah, it turns out that statement about the recording of Blue is bullshit. There's another quote that comes out later. Read the other quote that he will say, within a month or two of that one.
We did the last album in 6 months. We just whipped it out. And then there's some things on that album, on the second album, that I'm proud of. But the second album suffered from a kind of coldness almost. That's done in part because we were never in the studio at the same time, never rehearsed the songs together, and never played them together. I did my best to produce that record, and it was very hard to. Then we succumbed to the time pressures from Elektra to get the album out in 6 months, which we did. So it's not true.
So yeah, okay, wait. What? That's a complete and total contradiction. It's not like he said it was fun, and then later he said, well, it was kind of difficult sometimes too. He said we were together and had a lot of jam sessions. Then he said we were never together and we never had jam sessions. He literally says the exact opposite thing.
Isn't it amazing how Zoolander good looking he is and he can get away with his shit? I mean, he is.
Well, and it's funny that you say that.
There's so much evidence about him being a jerk.
In the research, I did find blogs and stuff from I found specifically, and I don't even think I put this in the show notes, but Vice sent a reporter, and the premise was they were sending this female reporter, and she was going to go on a quote date with Stephan Jenkins. This was in the last 5 years, and she framed the whole thing as how she was obsessed with him and how hot he was. This mythos around how attractive he is still a thing. And I don't know. I mean, we said that he was 30-something when the band started in 96. He is 60? No. He's a lot older than you. He's got a decade on you. He's about to turn 60.
Oh, that's amazing. I just can't believe that's a thing. Okay.
So back to Blue instead of just how hot this random man is. One illuminating piece of evidence that I did find was a podcast recording that Stephen made a year and a half ago, end of 2022. He sits down with his engineer and co-producer on Blue, a guy named Jason Carmer, and they go track by track, and they talk about the recording process, kind of. The whole podcast is like 30 minutes, so they don't get too, they don't go too deep. The most interesting part is that Stephan doesn't mention the other guys in the band. So It's 2022, and he goes out of his way to talk about how much of this album he created by himself or with Jason, where they were the only two people in the studio. In fact, Jason brings up Kevin at one point, and Stephan just does not respond. He doesn't say anything.
Pure genius. It sure is. I mean, dang, man. So clearly there's a lot of tension between Kevin and Stephan, even before the recording of this record, the Blue record. Eric Valentine has talked about the chaos of those two together during the making of the first record. But things got increasingly tricky during Blue because there was some tension around which songs make the album, which won't, because you can tell their visions were different. And here comes Eric Gotland back into the conversation.
Remember, I said he did several things. He pushed Stephan towards several key decisions, and there's a lot of these. They're woven into the story, and Eric, you kind of have to see behind the scenes to see that Eric is part of all this. But he's Stephan's friend, and he's managing, and he's part of the nucleus. And so when there are 20 songs, they get ready for Blue. This is still back in the heyday of the 90s where you're filling a CD. They got 20 tunes. They can't fit 20 tunes. And so Eric sets up a voting system. He convinces the band, because he's managing them at this point, that we're all going to vote. And remember, no one's in the room with each other. So this is ripe for dissent being sown. And this becomes another key part of, I'm sure if we called a therapist, we should do that. We should we should have like a hotline where we just bring in a therapist who would be like, explain to us the psychosis or the the unfit mental health that is at play here with the way this rock star reacted in this situation. But I think a therapist would tell you that isolating, these different relationships and then feeding them a line of information to turn people against each other is some classic narcissistic bullshit.
Yes.
And this is a very literal example of that happening, where there's nobody in the room with each other. And when the votes come back, basically surprisingly, Kevin's the only one voting for his songs.
Yeah. Which is, so his don't make the list, right? But on the list, a song called Slow Motion, which I now know about. So can you explain that to everyone, Brian?
This is classic Third Eye Blind lore, right? So this song becomes the domino that when you're trying to tell this story the way we're trying to tell it, I think this is the domino that sets things to collapse. If you're a fan of the band, you know about Slow Motion. I remember this in real time when I was in high school. This was it's funny to think that there wasn't much of an internet really around and stuff. So I must have been reading magazines and listening to shit on MTV. I don't know how I knew all this, but I'm going to breeze through the story here, because the story of the song itself is way less interesting than the actions that accompany it and what it leads to.
This is still like an old song for them, right?
Right. So that's one of the keys here, is that this is in the first batch of songs that Stephan will show to Eric before he has a band, when he's just calling this project his project or Third Eye Blind or whatever he's calling it. This predates everybody. And it's a satirical song about gun violence that he claims he wrote in the early 90s. So in both album cycles, he takes it to Elektra, and Elektra refuses to put it on the album.
Yeah, and I remember this.
Oh, you do remember this? Okay, yeah. It was hard for me to suss out if this was like a mainstream music news thing or just because I paid attention to the band.
Yeah, and was Columbine-ish time, too?
So, okay, when they go to Blue, it is Columbine time. That definitely didn't help. But someone high up at Elektra, there's also this story, if you dig, where somebody who, like Sylvia Rohn reports to, had a kid who was killed by gun violence, or a friend or something. There was some close connection to gun violence. And so she's like, I'm not taking this up to my bosses because it's going to be an emotional trigger. And so they have this huge fight about whether or not it can be allowed on the album.
So let's tell everyone about the compromise.
So, okay. There is, and in this podcast, that it is in the show notes, the one where he's talking about the making of this record back in the end of 22. He tells this story about Slow Motion about Sylvia showing up at the studio to have a conversation with them about it. And they make a compromise. And the album is going to have an instrumental version. And then Elektra tells them, which I'm going to say, when I bought that record when I was 17, I was like, what the fuck is this? Because it's just guitar strumming. There's no Satriani guitar playing on it. It's just like open chords. and then he sings the chorus, and they just took all the verses out because the narrative of it is a satire, but it's like, I'm going to kill this person, I'm going to shoot him. It's like, it's very violent and it's descriptive and it's gross. Now, I think in 2024, you listen to it and you're like, what the hell? I hear this all the time. But like then 25 years ago, it was weird. And so Elektra says, okay, instrumental version of this on the record so people know it exists. And then we'll give you $1 million. You can make an EP on which you can put the real version with the real lyrics. And this is where Stephan fucks up.
I'm so excited for this part of the podcast.
So this is basically, okay, this deal causes Kevin to re-engage with the business structure and the paperwork of this band because suddenly they have this other offer. They have new money coming into the band, and somehow, I don't know how it happens, but Kevin's paying attention again.
It's sort of like Sam Cooke getting the flu and suddenly reading about the books.
Yeah. Oh, okay, we talked about that recently. Sam Cooke gets the flu and then realizes Alan Klein is fucking him. Right. So it's sort of. Read this paragraph. There's a piece from the New York Times you got to read.
5 days before the band signed to Elektra Records, Mr. Jenkins, which is how we're going to be referring to him for this next paragraph, Mr. Jenkins established Third Eye Blind, Inc. as a corporation, naming himself as the corporation's sole owner and shareholder without telling anyone else in the four-member group, Mr. Cadigan said.
Okay, just pause. What the fuck?
Oh, yeah.
5 days before they... And guess who helps him fucking do it?
Yeah.
Eric Gotland. Eric Gotland sets that shit up. Eric Gotland is the man pulling the strings behind the scenes with Stephan.
Yeah. The record deal then signed Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Cadigan as artists professionally known as Third Eye Blind, but the payments were made to Third Eye Blind, Inc., which in effect hit to Mr. Jenkins.
I mean, again, business school shit. Like, you have to know how to set that up. I wouldn't even have known how to do that. Like, I wouldn't have thought of it. That you could set the entity as one thing, set the payments to something else, own the thing that's getting paid. Imagine this. You fight all the time anyway. Then your songs get cut from the record. And then you're looking at this deal that you're supposed to sign. So here, this is the reason Kevin's looking at it, right? I said like randomly he's looking at it. Part of the reason he's looking at it is because they have to sign the deal with Elektra. There's something in the paperwork where he has to sign off on it. Even though he's clearly like not getting all the money, he's involved enough in the paperwork where his signature is important. And so he now finds out, holy shit, this dude has been taking all this money. This is not a 50-50 arrangement. So read what happens next.
So the EP deal was then renegotiated to exclude Mr. Cadigan, and on January 18th, 2000, the money was transferred to Third Eye Blind, Inc. Exactly 1 week later, after a performance at the Sundance Film Festival. Is everyone ready? Okay, just making sure everybody's listening. After a performance at the Sundance Film Festival in Utah, Mr. Cadigan was told he had been cut from the band and replaced by Mr. Federlini?
Fridianelli is how I pronounce that. Yeah.
Fridianelli? Thank you, man. Mr. Cadigan said he returned to his hotel room to discover that, adding insult to injury, his hotel bill for the 4-day stay had been put in advance in his name and not the band's.
Holy
my gosh.
Shit. So here's something about this. And this is like the rumor and innuendo part, right? I remembered this story before jumping into the research as they left him in the middle of the night and gave him a note. I could not verify that that's what happened. I think what I did was confuse this detail about them leaving him holding the bill for his room. Similar. But here's another interesting anecdote about my fandom of this band. I have a bootleg of the Sundance performance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a shitty bootleg, but it is a piece of history. I think it's important to point out here that communication among band members, again, just this idea of it fragmenting. People being isolated, only being given pieces of information. And when that happens, you can turn people against each other. And holy shit.
Yeah. Later, Kevin will say, this is a quote from him, "I tried to explain it to the rest of the guys, but created a lot of discord in the band. I was leveraged out of the group because I wanted shares to be given to the rest of the band members and not just one guy."
Now, years later, after essentially every member of the band, other than Brad, the drummer, who we will talk about, has to face Stephan in court, They will come back and apologize for taking Stephen's side when this ouster happens, but they take his side.
Which is just totally weird.
But again, it's not weird.
Side.
It's not weird if you think about how the flow of information might have been happening. If he's charming and he is very good with, talking at people and getting people to agree with what he's saying, I could see how this could happen. Basically, the last 25 years have been a lot of this story we just told about Kevin Cadigan just repeating itself in different contexts. People keep getting surprised to find out that Stephen is only interested in looking out for himself.
Yeah. And Tony, how do you say his last name again?
Fredianelli.
Fredianelli.
He's one of these guys who was in an earlier iteration of the bait. Like when they bring him back, they're like, the whole PR push is Kevin's gone, but don't worry, we're bringing back our original guy. And he was like briefly in it playing keyboards or something, but they bring him back and are like, this is our guy now.
But he lasts in the band for a decade, but then he ends up in court, just like everybody else.
If you like business school shit and you like how do you get fucked in a rock band, there's a great piece from the Hollywood Reporter that dives into all of this. And this case is fascinating to me, this case specifically about Tony, because it made public how some of these employment deals within bands go down, right? So there is this concept of a hired gun. Explain that a little bit.
Well, right, basically. So Third Eye Blind could be Stephan Jenkins, and then there's just 3 other guys that are on a salary.
Which I never thought about this. Like up until recently, I never really thought through, like, why is there that one guy who's on all the Jimmy World tours, but, like, isn't in the promo pictures? And that's because he's a contract employee. Like, he's like a freelance musician who will go out and do this. And they've used the same guy. His name's Robin. They've used the same guy from their hometown, but they've never made him an official part of the band. It's just the business structure of the deal. He's not in the contract. He is, like, paid separately.
I've seen Green Day, and like they have an extra guitar player, not in any of the promo stuff, like at all. Like that's just sort of how that.
And that's why. I mean, this is a great thing to break down for people who maybe not know this, because I mean, I was a huge rock fan for years and never realized this. That's why, like, there will be like a full band, and then it'll be like you'll see pictures. Like 30 Seconds to Mars is this way right now. At some point, it was like a full band. Now it's like the promo photos are Jared Leto and some other guy.
Yeah, it's like 2 people or something.
Right.
It's weird like that. But the Stones are that way. It's like 3 guys. Although if you go see the Stones, Jagger's going to introduce everybody.
Yeah.
Every single person, but not everyone's in the promo.
Right. They're not, because they're not in the Rolling Stones business arrangement. This is business school shit. This is why you have to get really good business people when your band makes it. So in Tony's case, they put him on this is the deal they make up with him, which is this sort of makes sense from a business sense. They're like 2-year probationary period. And during that period, you're a contract employee. And then after 2 years, we'll buy you into the band. Like this time will basically allow you then to get a split of everything that we make. So for the first couple of years, I did the math because this all comes out in court documents. He makes like 80 to 100K, which is not great, but it's not terrible, especially 25 years ago. And, you think about it, bands, they have riders, they get food, they get extra stuff, I mean, it's so like if he's touring amphitheaters and clubs and that sort of thing, he's probably not hurting if he's making 100K. Then they say that after these 2 years, he gets his ownership stake. And to make a long story short, he gets it, but then it gets ripped away from him. There's like some stuff that happens. And eventually, buckle up for this, Stephen gets in a fight with Eric Gotland.
That's right.
The friend manager who's been doing all the cutthroat business shit for him, they're now in a fight.
What did Stephen do to piss him off?
Well, Stephen is pissed off at Eric because Stephen thinks he's cheating. Gotland will claim, like, listen, guy, you just haven't been making music. Because there's this dead period of this band's history from like 03 to 09 where they are out of the spotlight. They're not really doing much. They're not touring a ton. They're not making music. But at some point during this time, Stephen's mad because I guess his income is disappearing. And so he blames it all on Eric. I'm sure there's lots of other bullshit that goes into this because I'm sure Eric knows where all the skeletons are and Stephen knows where all the skeletons on Eric are. And I mean, there's some complicated interpersonal relations happening here. But Stephen will, again, do what he basically did to Kevin. He will hold the band hostage in their business deal to get them to testify against Eric Gotland. And basically straight up just to keep him employed. Tony will recant to Gotland at some point after he testifies against him. He'll say, I'm going to try to change my testimony. Stephen will get So mad that he freezes him out of the band and then eventually fires him. It's crazy shit.
So let's just have a lawsuit count for everybody.
You've been making little hash marks on a piece of paper.
Yeah, guitar player lawsuit with Stephen.
Yep.
Second guitar player lawsuit with Stephen.
Yep.
Manager lawsuit with Stephen.
Yep. Bass player quits, but then eventually sues Steven, saying he was basically bullied into signing away a bunch of his rights. And then we breezed over an early producer because it just, in the context of the story, would have gotten confusing. Very early on, there's a fight with another producer who creates demos before the first Third Eye Blind record. He helps him create demos, and they get in something that he has to settle out of court. And I'm sure there's people we're missing who get the legal business courtesy of Steven's ambition.
But the drummer is still in the band, right?
This is the part I find most fascinating. Like, how has the drummer stayed for almost 30 years? Like, I don't know what dirty pictures he has.
You know, a bad drummer will really fuck you up, but a great drummer will keep your band together forever.
And Steven will mention Brad's name in that interview from the end of 22. He will say something about how great Brad is as a drummer. And the last time I saw them, back to this idea of who's in the band and who's not from the business arrangement, they literally, there was a part of the show where the guys who make up the band now, including guys who have been in the band for a while, Chris Reed, who's been playing with them, he's Irish, he's been playing with them for like over a decade. And he is still there and seems to be getting paid, at least for now. But everybody else will be in black, and Steven and Brad will be in all white, like to symbolize that they are the core, which is just very interesting.
Everything about this is totally weird, man. I mean,
this is why I've been wanting to do this episode for 200 episodes. It's a great rock and roll story.
I'm such a jerk.
No.
Yeah. Okay. There's a quote from the bass player specifically in regards to Kevin. I'll read here. I was being fed a line by everyone surrounding the band, management, lawyers, accountants, and so was the drummer, about how Kevin was making trouble.
And so, yeah, this is back to that whole thing about how Steven had turned everyone against each other. Right? But what starts to happen is that along the way, after everything is cleared, let me just say this. My dad used to tell me, if everybody has a problem with Bob, Bob might be the problem. And so there is a certain point where everybody has a problem with Steven, and they all start to realize, oh shit, maybe Steven's the problem. And all of these people who had been worked against each other all get their turn to be kicked out of the band, as you just recounted for us with your tally marks. Thank you for that. And so this group of outcasts will end up making up and then coming back together.
So what did these guys do after this band?
Well, Kevin will put out music that no one listened to, including the songs that got voted off of Blue. He'll rework some of them and put them out. Orion, the bass player, will straight up quit music for a very long time. Tony will put up a Bandcamp site in 2012 with this bio. Read the bio from his Bandcamp.
All right. My name is Tony Lasagna, and I'm singer, songwriter, guitarist. Many of you know me from my 12-plus years as the guitarist from San Francisco band Third Eye Blind, but nowadays I'm fighting lawsuits to save my art.
Holy shit.
I'm putting this site up as a way for those of you out there to appreciate my many styles of music and those who would like to share in the experience of the journey of my career and joy. TF.
So my daughter thought I was playing Christmas music when I clicked on one of those demos on that Bandcamp page. So whatever that means.
That's ridiculous.
So anyway, fast forward to 2016. To get to the end of sort of I don't think this story's over, but to get to a stopping place. 16, Kevin Cadigan goes to do something that I had to do very recently. And he goes to renew his tags on his car in California. And while he's at the DMV, this is a true fucking story, he sees someone he recognizes. Literally hasn't seen the guy in like 15 years. And he sees Orion Salazar.
I got to go to the DMV. I hope it isn't something weird like this happens.
They make amends. They start hanging out again. Orion says later, when asked about this, that he hadn't taken a guitar off the wall in at least 3 years at this point. And Kevin had really saved him, got him back into music. Eventually, Tony Fredianelli comes back into the fold, and the three of them start playing together. But the problem is when they go to play gigs that it's hard to sell tickets without explaining what band they were all in together. And Stephen won't let them do that.
Are we about to get some cease and desist action going on?
He's very quick with the cease and desist letters. He gets this is crazy. He gets Eventbrite. So, because I've seen the Eventbrite letter.
This is so fucking awesome.
Somebody put one of these guys in an article or something, copied and like gave to the publication the Eventbrite letters from Eventbrite Corporate. He gets Eventbrite to not allow them to even mention Third Eye Blind on the ticket listings. Like, this goes on to such an extent that they actually bill one of their first gigs as, quote, original members of influential 90s band playing their 1997 debut album.
Isn't that embarrassing?
In 2017, Kevin Cadigan does an interview with the great Rob Harvilla, patron saint of this podcast. We love him, in which he explains his path this way. He says, I suppose it's similar to the Guns N' Roses thing, right? I think that was kind of the template for this. I think at the time, Stephen was talking about the others and making certain remarks, and as I look back, I think, oh, okay, this is foreshadowing here. Specifically, one time he said to me, you're going to be Izzy Stradlin. I think that should have been a clue.
Yeah, right. And what's so bad is that Izzy and Axl were good buddies from back in Indiana.
I mean, and that's the thing. That's the thing that Kevin eventually learned, and eventually the other guys learned. A little update on them: they've played over the last few years. I mean, now it's been almost 10. They've done some gigs as I think it's XEB is how they bill it. XEB, and they will do stuff from the first couple of albums. The three of them, they've done some small tours. I think they mostly play in California. Stephen, meanwhile, the band is still doing great. They're about to do another tour. Chris Reed, like I said, has been in the band for a long time. Brad is still there, and it's the nice guy didn't finish last in this case. I do think a couple things though. I don't think, as a super fan, I think Kevin plus Stephen is way better in musical output than anything one of them has done individually. I mean, the songs without Kevin have never been as good at Third Eye Blind, and the Kevin songs without Stephen seem a little bit too, you can tell Satriani was his guitar player too much. Like, there's nobody balancing out the technical parts. And so the pop sensibility goes away a little bit. There's a few good tunes, but you can actually, and I think if you dig through the show notes, you'll find it, but there's you can go find all these songs that were Cadigan songs that got cut from Blue. And you can go listen to them on Spotify. And most of them don't really mesh or gel very well because they've been completely reworked by Cadigan. And there's no Stephen in them at all. And so you just see this idea of what an artistic partnership can create, and then when businessy shit, as I keep saying in the show, gets in the way, what it can destroy. Well, there is some really interesting stuff in that interview about how Blue was created, in which, because there's a lot of stuff where they start playing with the studio. The producer says they spent $800,000 to make that record. And Stephen then says this last record that he made, Our Band Apart, which is the most recent Third Eye Blind record from 2021, he says what they spent on that, and it's nothing comparatively. And there is a part where the producer is talking about a guitar sound, and he's like, yeah, the way we got this guitar sound was we did this and this, and we layered it, and we did all this stuff. And he's like, we spent $30,000 getting that guitar to sound like that in the studio. That's what it cost. And it's a really interesting indictment of what the record industry used to be like versus what it's like now, and just what technology has done for the ability to produce and make things, and how that has good and bad, how it changes the whole arrangement, right? Like, I think part of the reason that maybe Stephan Jenkins has chilled out in terms of he's got some more long-lasting relationships now, etc., is that a lot of the ways that he was fucking people with business arrangements aren't business arrangements you can make anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't make the same money. So, like, the thing that he did, his consistent thing was business school shit. Like, he's not been in a lot of trouble for being creepy. He's not been in a lot of trouble for, I mean, you know, that stuff doesn't really exist. It's all business school shit. And it's harder to do business school shit in the music industry now. I honestly think that's maybe why we don't hear about this as much. I mean, people who tour with him and stuff say he's not easy to get along with. I mean, that's always been the case, and that's still a case. That was one of the guys from Jimmy Eat World said that recently, right, in the last few years. But as far as the band still existing, I do wonder if that's part of it. Anyway, this has been a very long episode. I appreciate the indulgence. If you hate Third Eye Blind, and you did before and you do still now, I appreciate you sticking around. If this makes you go and listen to those records and enjoy them, it'll be worth it, though, and I'm glad we got to do this. And thank you, Murdoch. Thanks for doing this for 200 episodes with me.
Oh, yeah. Well, why wouldn't I?
Let's do 200 more. You want to do 200 more?
Yeah. I mean, everyone seems to like it, so why not?
And if you have something to say, if you want to support the show to make sure we get to 400, that'd be really helpful, actually. Patreon.com is a way to do that. Patreon.com.
Yeah, remember, like I said last week, Michael Cohen... He has a podcast and Patreon. We need to right the wrongs in this world.
Help us out. Patreon.com/rock and roll bedtime stories. And remember, you can send us if you've got something you want to know about a band that's on the bill at Louder Than Life, you want us to do a deep dive, answer a question about one of them, we might send you to see that band at Louder Than Life. That is something we are able to do with our partnership there. Louder Than Life Music Festival. There's details in the show notes. Go check that out. It's going to be a blast again in September in our hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. We're excited to do that. Until next time, Murdoch, what should people keep doing?
Keep telling stories.
Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories is a Story Guys production. The show is produced and edited by Brian Eichenberger. Get more stories, hear more podcasts, and book the guys for your conference or house party at wearethestoryguys.com. Copyright Boy Have We Got Stories Productions. All rights reserved.